I never imagined that the dead would speak more honestly than the living, until the night a ghost proposed marriage on behalf of the man I had sworn to refuse. It happened in my own parlor, before witnesses, and it changed everything I believed about love, death, and the thin veil between them. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and I am what polite society calls a medium, though some use less charitable terms when they think I cannot hear. I speak with the departed. I have done so since I was a child, though I learned early to keep such gifts hidden, lest I be thought mad or worse. It was only after my husband died, 5 years ago now, that I allowed myself to use this ability openly, to help others find the closure I myself could never quite reach. My late husband, Thomas, was a good man, kind and steady, but he left me alone in this world at 23, and he has never once returned to me in spirit, though I have called for him in the dark hours more times than I care to admit. London, in the autumn of 1889, was a city of contrasts, where gaslight fought against the encroaching fog each evening, and where the living rushed past the dying without a second glance. I lived in Belgravia, in a narrow townhouse that had belonged to Thomas, its rooms now draped in the deep colors I preferred: burgundy, forest green, midnight blue. The parlor where I held my sessions was arranged with care. A round table stood at its center, covered in black velvet. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting shadows that seemed to breathe. The air always smelled of lavender and old roses, scents that the spirits seemed to favor, or perhaps it was only that I did. I held sessions twice a week on Tuesday and Friday evenings, and my clients were drawn from the better classes. Bereaved mothers who had lost children to scarlet fever, widowers who could not release their wives, sons and daughters seeking forgiveness for words left unspoken. I did not advertise. I did not need to. Grief has a way of finding those who can ease it, and my name passed quietly from one mourning household to another, always in whispers, always with a certain reverence and suspicion in equal measure. It was a Tuesday in late October when Inspector Adrian Wycliffe first appeared at my door. I remember the night precisely because the fog was particularly thick, swirling through the streets like something alive, and because I had been feeling restless all day, as though something were about to shift in the ordered pattern of my life. My housekeeper, Mrs. Bramwell, showed him into the entrance hall while I was preparing the parlor for the evening's session. I heard his voice first, low and measured, with an edge of authority that made me stiffen. When I emerged to greet him, I found a man of perhaps 35, tall and lean, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples, and eyes of such a peculiar gray-green that they seemed to see through pretense. He wore a well-tailored coat and carried himself with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to observing rather than being observed. His expression was neutral, polite, but I sensed the skepticism beneath it immediately, the way one senses a coming storm. He introduced himself with a slight bow. "Inspector Wycliffe," he said, "of Scotland Yard." He had come, he explained, because he had heard of my abilities and wished to attend one of my sessions. There was a case, he said carefully, that might benefit from such insights. A young woman of good family had died under circumstances that were troubling him. He did not say suspicious. He did not need to. I should have turned him away then. I had no patience for skeptics, for men who came to my parlor with their rational minds already closed, looking for tricks and wires and hidden accomplices. I had encountered enough of them over the years, journalists and self-appointed investigators who sought to expose me as a fraud, who could not accept that there were truths beyond the reach of their precious logic. But something in his gaze stopped me, some flicker of genuine uncertainty. Or perhaps it was only that he looked tired, as though he carried more than professional duty in his questions. I told him he could attend that evening's session if he wished, but that I required respectful silence and an open mind. He agreed with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes, and I left him in the entrance hall while I returned to my preparations, irritated with myself for allowing him entry. The session that night included 4 others, Lady Pemberton, who had lost her daughter to consumption, Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, who sought contact with their stillborn son, and Miss Violet Carr, a young woman whose fiancé had perished in a riding accident mere weeks before their wedding. They were all familiar to me, regulars who came month after month, seeking comfort in the fragments of connection I could offer them. Inspector Wycliffe sat apart from the group, near the wall, his presence a silent weight in the room. We gathered around the table as the clock struck 8. I asked them to join hands, to clear their minds, to open their hearts to those who waited beyond the veil. The candles flickered. The room grew cold, as it always did when the spirits drew near. I closed my eyes and let myself slip into that strange, suspended state where the living world recedes and the other presses close, full of whispers and shadows and half-formed faces. Lady Pemberton's daughter came first, as she often did, a gentle presence that brought the scent of lilacs and a feeling of peace. I relayed her messages, small reassurances that she was well, that she was not in pain, that she watched over her mother still. Lady Pemberton wept quietly, as she always did, and thanked me with trembling hands. Then the Ashford's child, who had never drawn breath in this world, made himself known through a sensation of warmth and light, a wordless presence that nonetheless conveyed love. Mrs. Ashford gasped and gripped her husband's hand tighter, and I saw tears on both their faces. Miss Carr's fiancé was more difficult. He was angry, I sensed, or perhaps only confused, caught between worlds, and unable to understand why he had been torn from life so suddenly. I struggled to make sense of his impressions, fragments of a fall, a horse's scream, pain, and then darkness. Miss Carr begged him to tell her he had loved her, and finally, I felt that affirmation, that surge of emotion, and I spoke it aloud. She dissolved into sobs, but they were, I thought, the kind that brought relief. Through it all, I was aware of Inspector Wycliffe watching me with those unsettling eyes, cataloging every word, every gesture. I could feel his skepticism like a cold draft, and it made me angry in a way I could not quite name. When the session ended and the others departed, murmuring their gratitude, he remained. He stood and approached the table slowly, his gaze moving over the candles, the velvet cloth, the empty chairs. Then he looked at me, and there was something in his expression I had not expected. Not mockery, but a kind of weary curiosity, as though he wanted to believe, but could not allow himself to. He asked me about the young woman who had died, the one he was investigating. Her name was Catherine Thornwood, he said, and she had been found in her family's garden 3 weeks prior, her body arranged as though she had simply lain down to sleep. There were no marks of violence, no signs of struggle. The physicians could find no cause of death. Her family insisted she had been in perfect health, planning her debut into society. But there had been something strange, he said, hesitating. In the days before her death, Catherine had told her maid that she felt watched, that she heard whispers in empty rooms, that she woke in the night with the certainty that someone stood beside her bed. I listened, and despite myself, I felt a chill. He wanted to know, he said, if I could contact her, if I could ask her what had happened. I should have refused him. I should have told him that the dead do not always wish to speak, that some deaths are too fresh, too raw, that spirits in such states are often confused or silent. But instead, I found myself agreeing to try, though I warned him that I could promise nothing. He nodded, his relief almost imperceptible, and arranged to return 2 nights hence, on the Friday, for a private session. After he left, I sat alone in the parlor for a long while, watching the candles burn down. Mrs. Bramwell came to ask if I needed anything, and I sent her to bed. The house settled into its nighttime stillness, the old beams creaking, the wind rattling the window panes. I tried to summon Thomas, as I sometimes did in these quiet hours, tried to feel his presence, to hear his voice. But as always, there was only silence. I did not understand why Inspector Wycliffe unsettled me so. Perhaps it was his skepticism, Or perhaps it was something else, something I was not ready to name. I only knew that I had agreed to help him, and that I had the distinct and troubling sense that I had just opened a door I would not easily close. The next 2 days passed slowly. I went about my usual routines, receiving callers, responding to letters, attending to the small details of my household. But my thoughts returned again and again to Catherine Thornwood, to the image of a young woman lying dead in a garden, and to the gray-green eyes of the man who sought answers. When Friday evening arrived, the fog was even thicker than before, pressing against the windows like something sentient. Inspector Wycliffe arrived precisely at 8, and this time he came alone. Mrs. Bramwell showed him in and then withdrew, leaving us in the candle-lit parlor. He removed his coat and hat, and I saw that he looked even more tired than he had before, as though he had not slept well. We sat across from each other at the round table, and I instructed him to place his hands palm down on the velvet. He did so, and I placed mine opposite his, not quite touching. The candles flickered. I closed my eyes and reached out into that other realm, searching for Catherine Thornwood. At first, there was nothing, only the familiar cold, the sense of vast emptiness. I called her name silently, again and again. I tried to form an image of her, young and dark-haired, lying in a garden. I opened myself fully, more fully than I usually dared, and waited. And then, suddenly, she was there. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once. A presence so strong and so desperate that I gasped aloud. She was frightened, terribly frightened. I could feel her panic like a living thing, could sense her trying to speak but unable to form words. Images flooded through me. A darkened room, a figure in the shadows, hands reaching for her, and then a sensation of falling, of cold spreading through her limbs, of her heart slowing and stopping while her mind screamed. I tried to hold on to her, to ask her who had done this, but she was slipping away, her terror pulling her back into the darkness. I felt her one last time, a surge of sorrow and regret, and then she was gone. I opened my eyes to find Inspector Wycliffe staring at me with an expression of shock. I realized my face was wet with tears, though I had not known I was crying. My hands were trembling. "She was murdered," I said, my voice hoarse. "Someone killed her. She felt it happening. She felt herself dying." He leaned forward, his skepticism gone, replaced by something raw and urgent. "Who?" he asked. "Did she show you who?" I shook my head. It was too fast. She was too frightened. But there was someone there, in her room. Someone she knew, I think. She was not expecting danger. He sat back, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists on the table. Then he looked at me again, and I saw belief in his eyes, belief and something else, a vulnerability that took me by surprise. "I did not want to believe you," he said quietly. "I came here thinking you were either a charlatan or deluded. But I felt something just now. I do not understand it, but I felt it." I said nothing. I was still shaken by the force of Catherine's presence, by the rawness of her fear. Inspector Wycliffe stood and paced to the window, staring out into the fog. "I will find who did this," he said, more to himself than to me. "I will not let her death be forgotten." He turned back to me, and for a moment we simply looked at one another. There was a strange intimacy in that gaze, born of shared witness to something neither of us could fully explain. He asked if he might return, if I would be willing to try again, to see if Catherine could tell us more. I hesitated. Everything in me said I should refuse, that I should send him away and close that door. But instead, I heard myself agree. He left shortly after, and I remained in the parlor, exhausted and unsettled. The candles had burned low, and the room felt different somehow, as though Catherine's presence had left a mark. I wondered what I had begun, and whether I would come to regret it. I did not know then that the dead had more to say than I could have imagined, or that the truth waiting to be uncovered would bind me to Inspector Adrian Wycliffe in ways I could never have foreseen. All I knew was that I had felt something shift, some deep and irrevocable change, and that when I finally climbed the stairs to my cold and empty bed, I could not shake the memory of his eyes, or the ghost of Catherine Thornwood's terror, or the sense that my carefully ordered life was about to come undone. Inspector Wycliffe returned 3 days later, on a Monday afternoon when the autumn light was thin and gray. I had not expected him so soon, and I confess I felt a flutter of something I refused to name when Mrs. Bramwell announced his arrival. I was in my study, writing letters, and I made him wait longer than was strictly polite before I descended to receive him. He stood in the entrance hall with his hat in his hands, and he looked at me with an intensity that made me falter on the bottom step. He had not come for another session, he explained. He had come to ask my help in a different manner. The investigation into Catherine Thornwood's death had led him to her family's townhouse in Mayfair, and he wished me to accompany him there, to see if I might sense something in the place where she had lived, where she had felt watched and heard whispers. I told him that I was not a detective, that my gift did not work in such a way, that I could not simply walk into a house and divine its secrets. He listened patiently, and then he said something that surprised me. He said that he believed I could help precisely because I was not a detective, because I saw things he could not, felt things his rational mind would dismiss. He said it without mockery, without the skepticism that had marked our first meeting, and I found myself unable to refuse him. We traveled to Mayfair in his carriage, a plain black vehicle that smelled of leather and old tobacco. He sat across from me, silent for much of the journey, his gaze fixed on the passing streets. I studied him when I thought he was not looking, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when we passed certain neighborhoods. There was something haunted about him, I thought, something that went beyond professional dedication. The Thornwood residence was a grand affair, all white stone and iron railings, with tall windows that looked out onto a private garden. A butler admitted us with the cold formality of the very wealthy, and we were shown into a drawing room to wait while he informed the family of our arrival. The room was stifling in its perfection, every surface polished, every cushion arranged just so. It felt like a place where nothing real had ever happened, where emotion was kept carefully hidden behind good breeding and thick curtains. Lady Thornwood received us herself, a woman of perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair, and a face that might have been beautiful if it had ever learned to soften. She was Catherine's mother, and she looked at me with barely concealed distaste when Inspector Wycliffe introduced me as someone who might provide insight into her daughter's state of mind. She did not believe in mediums, she said coldly. She did not believe in spiritualism or table rapping or any of the other nonsense that preyed upon the grieving. But she would tolerate my presence if the inspector thought it necessary. I said nothing. I had long ago learned that arguing with such people was pointless. Instead, I asked quietly if I might see Catherine's room, and after a long pause, Lady Thornwood agreed, though her mouth thinned into a hard line. Catherine's bedroom was on the second floor, at the back of the house, overlooking the garden. It had been kept exactly as it was, Lady Thornwood explained, as though her daughter might return at any moment. The bed was made with pale blue linens. A dressing table held silver-backed brushes and small bottles of perfume. Watercolors hung on the walls, delicate paintings of flowers and countryside scenes. It was a young woman's room, pretty and careful, and somehow sad in its untouched stillness. I walked slowly around the space, trying to open myself to whatever might remain. Inspector Wycliffe and Lady Thornwood waited by the door watching me. I felt the weight of their attention, Lady Thornwood's disdain and the inspector's quiet hope, and I tried to block them both out. At first, there was nothing. The room felt empty, sterile, as though Catherine's presence had been scrubbed away along with any trace of her death. But then, as I approached the window, I felt it. A coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature, a sense of unease that made my skin prickle. I looked out at the garden below, at the neat paths and autumn flowers, and I saw where she had been found, a small bench beneath an oak tree. I turned back to the room, and suddenly I was seeing it differently. Not as it was now, pristine and still, but as it had been that night. I saw shadows moving in the corners. I felt Catherine's fear, sharp and immediate. She had been lying in bed, I realized, trying to sleep when she had heard something. A sound. Footsteps, perhaps, or the creak of a floorboard. She had sat up, her heart racing, and she had seen someone standing near the door. I gasped and pressed my hand to my chest, the sensation so vivid that I forgot for a moment where I was. Inspector Wycliffe was beside me instantly, his hand on my elbow, steadying me. I heard Lady Thornwood make a sound of disgust, muttering about theatrics, but I barely registered it. "Who was it?" the inspector asked urgently. "Did you see who it was?" I shook my head, struggling to hold on to the impression. It was fading already, slipping back into the silence. But I knew this much. Catherine had recognized the person. She had not screamed. She had not tried to flee. She had spoken to them, though I could not hear the words. And then she had felt a sudden, overwhelming drowsiness, as though she could not keep her eyes open. She had thought, in those last moments, that she was simply falling asleep. "She was drugged," I said aloud. "Someone gave her something. She did not know she was dying. She thought she was only tired." Inspector Wycliffe's grip on my arm tightened. His face had gone pale. Lady Thornwood demanded to know what I was talking about, her voice shrill with anger or fear or both. The inspector released me and turned to her, his voice calm but firm. He explained that there was reason to believe Catherine had been poisoned, that her death was not natural, and that he intended to discover who was responsible. Lady Thornwood collapsed into a chair, her composure finally shattering. She covered her face with her hands and wept, deep, wrenching sobs that filled the room. I felt a surge of pity for her, for the grief she had kept locked behind her coldness, and I knelt beside her chair and placed my hand gently on her arm. She did not pull away. After several minutes, she composed herself enough to speak. She told us, her voice hoarse, that Catherine had been engaged to be married. The young man's name was Mr. Edmund Ashford, the son of a wealthy manufacturing family. It had been an advantageous match, Lady Thornwood said, one that would have secured Catherine's future. But Catherine had confessed to her mother, just days before her death, that she did not love him, that she feared the marriage, that she wished she could refuse. Had she refused? Inspector Wycliffe asked. Had she broken the engagement? Lady Thornwood shook her head. She had told Catherine that love was a luxury, that duty and security mattered more, that she would learn to be content. She had forbidden her daughter to speak of it again. And now, she said, her voice breaking, now Catherine was dead, and she would never know if her daughter had forgiven her. We left the Thornwood house shortly after, Lady Thornwood's grief still echoing in my ears. The carriage ride back to Belgravia was silent at first. Inspector Wycliffe sat with his hands clasped, his gaze distant, turning over the new information. Finally he spoke, asking me if I truly believed what I had felt in that room, if I was certain Catherine had been drugged. I told him I was as certain as I could be, that the spirits did not lie, but that my interpretations were imperfect, filtered through my own understanding. He nodded, absorbing this, and then he said something that surprised me. He said that his own brother had died 5 years ago, under circumstances that were never fully explained. A fall down the stairs in their family home, late at night, when no one else was awake to witness it. The physicians had called it an accident, but Adrian had never believed it, had always suspected that there was more to the story. He had become an inspector, he said, because he could not save his brother, but he could seek justice for others. I looked at him, and I saw the pain in his eyes, the old wound that had never healed. I understood then why he had come to me, why he had been willing to set aside his skepticism. He was not seeking only justice for Catherine Thornwood. He was seeking it for his brother as well, and perhaps for himself. I told him I was sorry for his loss, and he thanked me quietly. We did not speak again until the carriage stopped before my house. He helped me down, his hand warm and steady on mine, and he asked if he might call on me again if the investigation required it. I agreed, though I knew I should not, though every instinct warned me that I was allowing him too close, that I was beginning to care about more than simply contacting the dead. Over the following week, Inspector Wycliffe visited me 3 more times. Twice we attempted to reach Catherine's spirit again, hoping she might reveal more, but she did not return, or perhaps she could not. The 3rd time, he came simply to discuss the case, to share what he had learned from his inquiries. Mr. Edmund Ashford had an alibi for the night of Catherine's death, he told me, having been at his club until the early hours of the morning. But the inspector had discovered something else. Catherine's lady's maid, a young woman named Mary, had left the Thornwood household abruptly the day after Catherine's death and had not been seen since. He asked if I would be willing to hold another session, one where he might bring people connected to Catherine, to see if any of them provoked a response from the other side. I hesitated. I did not like the idea of turning my parlor into an interrogation room, of using the spirits as tools for detection, but I could not deny that I wanted to help him, that I wanted to see justice done for Catherine, and perhaps, if I was honest with myself, I wanted an excuse to see him again. I agreed, and we set a date for the following Friday. He would bring Lady Thornwood, Mr. Ashford, and Catherine's father, Lord Thornwood, who had been away on business at the time of her death and had only recently returned. I spent the intervening days in a state of anxious anticipation, unable to concentrate on my usual routines, my thoughts circling endlessly around the case and around Inspector Wycliffe himself. I had begun to dream of him. In these dreams we were not in my parlor or in a carriage or in the Thornwood house. We were in places I did not recognize, walking through mist-shrouded gardens or standing in empty rooms filled with candlelight. He would reach for me, and I would pull away, and always I would wake with my heart racing and a sense of loss so profound it took my breath away. I knew what was happening. I was not so naive as to misunderstand. I was falling in love with him. Or perhaps it was something less and more complicated than love, a dangerous attraction born of shared purpose and emotional intensity. But I could not allow it. I could not allow myself to hope that he might feel the same, that a man like him, rational and respectable, could care for a woman like me, who spoke to ghosts and lived on the edges of society's acceptance. The Friday session arrived, and with it came a storm. Rain lashed the windows, and thunder rolled through the London sky like a warning. Inspector Wycliffe arrived first, bringing with him Lady Thornwood, Lord Thornwood, and Mr. Edmund Ashford. Lord Thornwood was a tall man with a military bearing and a face carved from stone. Mr. Ashford was younger, perhaps 25, handsome in a soft, unfinished way, and clearly uncomfortable. They all settled around my table with varying degrees of skepticism and hostility, and I felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on me. I began the session as I always did, asking them to join hands, to open their minds. The candles flickered wildly in the drafts from the storm. The room grew cold, colder than I had ever felt it, and I sensed immediately that something was different tonight, that the boundary between worlds was thinner than usual. I called for Catherine, my voice steady despite the unease crawling up my spine. I called for her again and again, and then, just when I thought she would not come, I felt her. But she was not alone. There was another presence with her, stronger and more insistent, pushing forward as though it had been waiting for this moment. I tried to focus on Catherine, to hold her, but the other presence overwhelmed me, flooding through me with such force that I cried out. Images came in a rush. A young man, dark-haired and laughing. A staircase, steep and shadowed. A hand on his back, pushing. A moment of terror, a fall, darkness. And then, impossibly, I heard a voice, clear and urgent, speaking directly into my mind. "Tell him," the voice said. "Tell Adrian that I forgive him. Tell him it was not his fault. Tell him to stop punishing himself." I opened my eyes, gasping, my vision swimming. Inspector Wycliffe was staring at me, his face white, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were bloodless. "Your brother is here," I said, my voice shaking. "He says he forgives you. He says it was not your fault." The room fell silent. Even the storm seemed to pause, holding its breath. And then, before anyone could react, I felt the presence surge again, more powerful than before, and I heard the voice speak once more, words that would change everything. "Tell him to marry you, Eleanor Hartwell. Tell him that you are meant to be together, that this is why I brought him to you. Tell him not to be a fool." I felt the blood drain from my face. Around the table, the others stared at me, shocked and confused. But I could only look at Inspector Wycliffe, at Adrian, and see the truth written in his eyes. Horror, disbelief, and beneath it all, something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. The séance ended in chaos. Lady Thornwood demanded to know what manner of spectacle this was, her voice sharp with outrage. Lord Thornwood rose from his chair so abruptly it toppled backward, declaring the entire affair an obscenity. Mr. Ashford simply stared at me with wide, frightened eyes, as though I had transformed into something monstrous before him. And Inspector Wycliffe, Adrian, sat frozen, his face drained of all color, his gray-green eyes locked on mine with an expression I could not read. I tried to speak, to explain, but my voice would not come. The presence of Adrian's brother had withdrawn as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving me feeling hollow and exposed. Mrs. Bramwell appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, and I managed to gesture weakly for her to show the guests out. They left in a flurry of angry muttering and rustling silk, all except Adrian, who remained seated at the table, his hands still gripping its edge as though it were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. When the door closed behind the others, silence settled over the parlor like a shroud. The candles had burned low, guttering in their holders, casting wild shadows across the walls. The storm outside had intensified, rain hammering against the windows with such force I thought the glass might shatter. I sat across from Adrian, neither of us moving, neither of us speaking, the ghost of his brother's words hanging in the air between us. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know his name?" "I never told you his name." I had not realized until that moment that I did know it, that the Spirit had given it to me along with everything else. "James," I said quietly. "Your brother's name was James." He flinched as though I had struck him. His hands began to tremble, and he released the table, pressing his palms against his face. I watched him struggle for composure, watched him fight against the tide of grief and guilt and something else, something that looked like hope and terrified him. I wanted to go to him, to place my hand on his shoulder, to offer some comfort, but I did not dare. Instead, I waited, letting him take the time he needed. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "He fell," Adrian said, his voice rough, "down the main staircase of our family home. I found him at the bottom, his neck broken. It was 3 a.m. I had been asleep in my room. I heard nothing. I woke to our housekeeper screaming. "I am sorry," I said, though the words felt inadequate. He shook his head. "You do not understand. It was my fault. We had argued that evening, James and I. He wanted to marry a woman, a governess in a neighboring household. Our father forbade it. She was unsuitable, he said, beneath our station. James was furious. He told me I was a coward for not defending him, for not standing up to our father. We exchanged terrible words. I told him he was being a fool, that he would ruin himself for a woman who was not worth it. He struck me. I struck him back, and then I left him there, angry and hurt, and I went to bed. When I woke, he was dead. The pain in his voice was unbearable, I found myself moving without thinking, leaving my chair and kneeling beside his, taking his cold hands in mine. He looked down at me, startled, and I saw tears begin to slip down his face. "It was not your fault," I said firmly. "You could not have known. An argument is not a murder." "But what if it was not an accident?" he said. "What if someone pushed him, just as you saw in your vision? What if he was killed because of that woman, or because of our father's refusal, or for reasons I will never understand? And what if I could have saved him, if I had not been so angry, if I had stayed with him?" I squeezed his hands tighter. "Your brother came tonight to tell you that he forgives you. That means he does not blame you. You must find a way to forgive yourself." He stared at me for a long moment, and then slowly he pulled one hand free and reached up to touch my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "What he said about you," Adrian whispered. "About us. Did he mean it? Or was it only your mind, giving voice to something you wished to hear?" I felt heat flood my face. I started to pull away, but he held me there, his hand cupping my jaw, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone. "I did not wish to hear it," I said, and it was the truth. I had not allowed myself to wish for anything from him, had not dared to imagine that he might see me as anything other than a useful tool in his investigation. "Then why did he say it?" Adrian asked, his voice low and rough. "I do not know," I whispered. "The dead do not always make sense. They see things we cannot. Perhaps he saw something between us that we have not yet acknowledged, or perhaps he simply wanted you to be happy, and he thought I might make you so." "And would you," he asked, "make me happy?" The question hung between us, dangerous and irrevocable. I knew that if I answered honestly, if I admitted the truth, there would be no going back. And yet I found I could not lie to him, not with his hand on my face, not with his eyes searching mine as though I held the answer to every question he had ever asked. "I do not know," I said again, my voice breaking. "But I would try, if you wanted me to." He closed his eyes, a shudder running through him, and then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against mine. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, the storm raging around us, and I felt something shift and settle in my chest, something that felt like both terror and peace. When he finally pulled back, he did not release me. Instead, he helped me to my feet and then stood himself, still holding my hand. "We need to find who killed Catherine," he said, and there was a new resolve in his voice. "And I need to find out what truly happened to James. Will you help me?" I nodded, unable to speak. He raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and so tender that I thought my heart might break. Then he left, disappearing into the storm, and I stood alone in my parlor, my hand still warm from his touch, wondering what I had just promised and whether I would live to regret it. The following days were strange and dreamlike. Adrian called on me every afternoon, sometimes with news of the investigation, sometimes simply to sit with me in my parlor and talk. We spoke of many things: his childhood, my own, the nature of death and grief, the question of what lay beyond. He told me more about James, about the brother who had been reckless and passionate and alive in ways Adrian had never allowed himself to be. I told him about Thomas, about the gentle, quiet man I had married and lost, and about the loneliness that had followed. He never mentioned the proposal James's spirit had made, and neither did I, but it was there between us always, an unspoken possibility that colored everything we said and did. I found myself watching him when he was not looking, memorizing the line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he leaned over a document, the rare and beautiful smile that transformed his serious face. And I caught him watching me in return, his gaze lingering on my mouth, my hands, the curve of my neck. The investigation into Catherine's death had stalled. The missing maid, Mary, had not been found, and Mr. Ashford's alibi remained solid. But Adrian was convinced there was more to uncover, and he had begun looking into Catherine's father, Lord Thornwood, who had been away on business at the time of her death, but who had returned looking, Adrian said, like a man carrying a terrible secret. It was nearly 2 weeks after the séance when Adrian arrived at my door one evening, unannounced and agitated. I was in the drawing room, reading by the fire, and I rose immediately when Mrs. Bramwell showed him in. He looked as though he had not slept, his eyes shadowed, his coat rumpled. "I found her," he said without preamble. "Mary, the maid. She has been hiding in Whitechapel, terrified. She told me everything." I gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, too restless to be still. He told me that Mary had been in the house the night Catherine died, that she had heard voices in Catherine's room late at night and had gone to investigate. She had seen someone leaving Catherine's bedroom, someone she recognized. Lord Thornwood, Catherine's own father. I felt my blood run cold. "Why would he?" I began, but Adrian interrupted. "Mary overheard them arguing earlier that evening," he said. "Lord Thornwood had discovered that Catherine had been corresponding with someone, a young man she had met at a charity function, someone entirely unsuitable. A clerk, Mary said, with no family and no prospects. Catherine had been planning to run away with him, to break her engagement to Mr. Ashford and marry for love. Lord Thornwood was enraged. He told her she would disgrace the family, that he would not allow it. And so he killed her," I said, the horror of it washing over me. Adrian nodded grimly. "Mary believes he gave Catherine laudanum, a large dose, enough to ensure she would not wake. She believes he carried her to the garden himself and arranged her there, making it look as though she had simply fallen asleep. He thought it would be ruled a natural death, a weak heart or a sudden illness. He did not expect anyone to question it." "But you did," I said softly. He met my eyes. "Because of you. Because you told me she had been drugged, that she had died in fear. Without that, I would have accepted the physician's verdict. Catherine would have been buried, and her father would have gone unpunished. What will you do now?" I asked. "He will be arrested." Adrian said, "I have constables waiting outside the Thornwood house as we speak. Mary has agreed to testify. There is enough evidence to bring him to trial." He paused, his expression softening. "I came to tell you first. You deserved to know. You gave her justice." We stood in silence for a moment, the fire crackling in the hearth, and I felt a deep and weary sadness. Justice, I thought, but at what cost? Catherine was still dead. A family was destroyed, and somewhere in the city, a young clerk was mourning a woman he would never see again. Adrian stepped closer, and I looked up at him, seeing the exhaustion and relief and something else in his eyes. He reached for my hand, and I gave it to him without hesitation. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly, "and I need you to be honest with me." I nodded, my heart beginning to race. "When James spoke through you," he said slowly, "when he told me to marry you, did you feel anything? Did you sense whether he was speaking truth, or whether he was simply meddling, the way he always did in life?" I considered the question carefully. I had asked myself the same thing 100 times in the days since. I felt that he believed it, I said finally. "Whether it is true or not, I cannot say. The dead see differently than we do. They see patterns and connections we cannot perceive. Perhaps he saw that we could be happy together, or perhaps he simply wanted his brother to stop living in the past and to take a chance on the future." Adrian smiled faintly. "That sounds like James. Always pushing, always certain he knew best." He looked down at our joined hands, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I do not know if I believe in fate, Eleanor. I do not know if I believe that the dead can guide the living or that love is anything more than chance and circumstance. But I know that I have not felt this way about anyone since before James died. I know that when I am with you, The weight I have carried for 5 years feels lighter, and I know that I would very much like to find out if my brother was right. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I blinked them back. "What are you saying?" I whispered. He raised my hand to his lips again, and this time he did not let go. "I am saying that I would like to court you, Eleanor Hartwell, properly, respectably. I would like to take you to dinner, to the theater, to walk with you in the park. I would like to introduce you to what remains of my family and to show the world that I am not ashamed to care for a woman who speaks to ghosts. And if, in time, you find that you could care for me as well, then perhaps we might consider whether James knew what he was talking about." I stared at him, my heart swelling with a joy so fierce it frightened me. "Yes," I said, and my voice came out stronger than I expected. "Yes, Adrian. I would like that very much." He pulled me into his arms then, holding me close, and I felt his heart beating against mine, steady and sure. We stood like that for a long time, the fire warming us, the house settling into its evening stillness, and I allowed myself, for the first time in 5 years, to hope that I might not be alone forever, that I might have a future that held more than simply speaking to the dead. But even in that moment of happiness, I felt a shadow at the edge of my awareness, a sense that something was not yet finished, that there were still truths waiting to be uncovered. I pushed the feeling away, choosing instead to focus on the man in my arms, on the solid reality of him, on the possibility of love that I had thought lost to me forever. I did not know then that the spirits had more to reveal, or that the truth about James's death would soon force us to confront questions we were not ready to answer. All I knew was that I had found something precious and rare, and that I would fight to keep it, no matter what shadows the past might cast upon our fragile and newborn hope. The weeks that followed were the happiest I had known since Thomas died, and perhaps even before that. Adrian courted me with a quiet intensity that took my breath away. He came to call every afternoon, bringing flowers or books or simply his presence. We walked in Hyde Park despite the November chill, our hands brushing beneath the cover of my cloak. We attended the theater, sitting close in the dim light while the actors played out their dramas on stage. He took me to dinner at discreet establishments where the food was excellent and the staff knew better than to gossip about their patrons. He was different away from the investigation, away from the weight of death and duty. He laughed more easily, his gray-green eyes warming when they rested on me. He told me stories of his childhood, of growing up with James in their family's country house in Hertfordshire, of the pranks they had played and the adventures they had shared. He spoke of his parents, both now deceased, and of the loneliness he had felt since losing them, and then his brother, of how he had thrown himself into his work to avoid the emptiness. I, in turn, told him things I had never spoken of to anyone. I told him about the first time I had seen a spirit at the age of 7, a woman in a gray dress standing at the foot of my bed. I told him how my parents had dismissed it as nightmares, how I had learned to hide my gift, to pretend I was like everyone else. I told him about Thomas, about how kind he had been, how patient, but also how I had never quite loved him the way I thought a wife should love a husband. I had cared for him deeply, but there had been no passion, no fire, only a gentle affection that had made his death easier to bear and harder to mourn. Adrian listened to everything I said with complete attention, never judging, never dismissing. He asked questions, thoughtful questions that showed he was truly trying to understand me. And slowly, carefully, we built something between us, something that felt both fragile and unbreakable, like spun glass that had somehow been tempered into steel. But beneath the happiness, I could not shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. James's spirit had not returned since that dramatic séance, and I wondered why. I wondered what he was waiting for, or if his message had been his final one, his last gift to his brother before moving on to whatever lay beyond. Adrian did not speak of it, seemed determined to focus on the present rather than the past. But I caught him sometimes staring into the distance with a troubled expression, and I knew he was thinking of the brother he had lost and the questions that remained unanswered. It was early December, nearly a month after Lord Thornwood's arrest, when everything changed again. I had held a session that evening, a small gathering of regular clients, and Adrian had waited in my study while I worked, reading through some papers he had brought with him. When the session ended and my guests departed, I found him standing by the window, his face pale in the lamplight, a letter clutched in his hand. I asked what was wrong, and he turned to me with an expression of such anguish that I felt my heart clench. He handed me the letter without a word, and I read it by the flickering light of my desk lamp. It was from Adrian's father's solicitor, a man named Mr. Pemberton, who had been managing the family's affairs since the elder Wycliffe's death. The letter explained that Mr. Pemberton had recently been going through old documents and had discovered something disturbing among Adrian's father's private papers. A journal entry, dated the night of James's death, in which his father had written a confession. James had not fallen, the letter explained. He had been pushed by their father. I looked up at Adrian, horror washing through me. He was shaking, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might crack. I set the letter down and went to him, taking his cold hands in mine, but he pulled away, turning back to the window as though he could not bear to be touched. He told me the rest in a voice devoid of emotion, as though he were reciting facts from a case file rather than speaking of his own family's destruction. His father had been in financial difficulties he had hidden from everyone. He had made poor investments and had accumulated debts that threatened to destroy the family's reputation and fortune. James's proposed marriage to the governess would have ruined any chance of recovering through an advantageous match. Their father had tried to reason with James, had tried to convince him to give up the woman and marry someone suitable, but James had refused. On the night of the argument, after Adrian had gone to bed, their father had followed James upstairs. He had tried one last time to make him see reason. When James refused again, when he told their father that he would marry whom he chose and that no amount of money or status was worth sacrificing love, something in their father had broken. He had pushed James a single shove, perhaps not even intending to kill him, only to silence him, to make him stop. But James had lost his balance at the top of the stairs, had fallen backward, and the fall had killed him instantly. Their father had stood there, the journal entry said, staring at his son's body, and had known immediately that he had destroyed everything he had been trying to save. He had made it look like an accident, had woken the housekeeper and pretended to have just discovered the body himself. And then he had lived with the guilt for 2 more years before his own heart gave out, taking the secret with him to the grave. Or so he had thought. I felt sick. I thought of Adrian, carrying the weight of guilt for 5 years, believing he was responsible for his brother's death, while all along it had been his father. I thought of James, dying for love, for the simple desire to choose his own path. And I thought of the man who had raised them both, driven to murder by pride and fear and desperation. Adrian, I said softly, this is not your fault. You could not have known. He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Could I not? I knew my father was under financial strain. I knew he was obsessed with maintaining appearances, with preserving the family name. I should have protected James. I should have stood with him against our father. Instead, I argued with him. I called him a fool, and I left him alone and vulnerable. You were not the one who pushed him, I said firmly. Your father made a choice, a terrible, unforgivable choice. But it was his choice, not yours. Adrian turned to face me, and I saw tears streaming down his face, tears he did not bother to wipe away. How can I court you now? He said. How can I ask you to tie yourself to a family with such darkness in its blood? My father was a murderer, Eleanor. What does that make me? I crossed the space between us and took his face in my hands, forcing him to look at me. It makes you a man who has spent 5 years seeking justice for others because he could not find it for his brother, I said. It makes you someone who cares so deeply about right and wrong that you have dedicated your life to protecting the innocent. It makes you exactly the man I have come to love. The words were out before I could stop them, hanging in the air between us, raw and true. Adrian stared at me, his eyes widening, and then he pulled me against him, burying his face in my hair, his whole body shaking with silent sobs. We stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the lamplight while the December wind rattled the windows. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were red but clearer, as though something had broken open inside him and released the poison that had been festering there. "I love you too," he said hoarsely. "I think I have loved you since that first night, when you reached through death itself to bring me Catherine's truth. I do not deserve you, but I love you nonetheless." I smiled through my own tears. "Then we are well matched," I said, "because I do not deserve you either." He kissed me then, gentle and desperate all at once, and I kissed him back, tasting salt and sorrow and something that felt like the beginning of healing. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, and I saw in his eyes a question he had not yet voiced. "What do I do now?" he asked. "How do I live with this knowledge?" I thought carefully before answering. "You honor James," I said. "You honor him by living the life he could not, by choosing love over duty, by being honest and true, even when it costs you. And you forgive your father, not because he deserves it, but because carrying hatred will only destroy you as surely as guilt has done." "Can you help me?" he asked quietly. "Can you help me speak to James one more time? I need to tell him the truth. I need to ask his forgiveness, not for something I did, but for not protecting him from our father." I hesitated. Contacting James again would not be easy. Strong spirits like his did not often return once they had delivered their message. But I could see how much Adrian needed this, how much he needed closure, and I could not refuse him. "I will try," I said, "but I cannot promise he will come. The dead have their own reasons for speaking and for staying silent." We decided to hold the session the following evening, just the two of us. Adrian would bring something of James's, an object that had been meaningful to him, to help draw his spirit. I spent the day in preparation, fasting and meditating, opening myself as fully as I dared to the other side. When Adrian arrived that evening, he looked haggard but determined. He carried with him a pocket watch, silver and beautifully engraved, that had belonged to James. He told me that James had carried it always, that it had been a gift from the governess he had loved, the woman for whom he had been willing to risk everything. We sat together at my table in the candlelit parlor, the watch between us, our hands clasped. I closed my eyes and reached out, calling for James, asking him to return, to speak once more to his brother. At first there was nothing, only the familiar emptiness and cold. But then, slowly, I felt him beginning to form, his presence tentative, as though he were uncertain whether to come. I encouraged him gently, telling him that Adrian needed him, that there was something he needed to say. And finally, James was there, his spirit stronger and clearer than it had been before, as though he had been waiting for this moment. I opened my eyes and looked at Adrian. "He is here," I said softly. "Speak to him." Adrian swallowed hard, his grip on my hands tightening. "James," he said, his voice breaking, "I know the truth now. I know what Father did. I know it was not an accident. And I know that I failed you. I should have protected you. I should have stood with you. I am so sorry." Through me, I felt James's response, a wave of love and sadness and something that felt like exasperation. I translated his feelings into words, speaking in the strange, distant voice that came when the spirits used me as their vessel. "You did not fail me," I said, but the words were James's. "Father made his choice. You could not have stopped him without knowing what he intended, and how could you have known? He was our father. We trusted him. Do not carry this guilt, Adrian. It is not yours to bear. But I called you a fool, Adrian said, tears streaming down his face. I told you that you would ruin yourself for a woman who was not worth it. Those were the last words I spoke to you, and they were cruel and wrong. I felt James's presence surge with emotion, and I spoke again. She was worth it, James said through me. She was worth everything. And you were right to be angry with me for not considering the consequences, but you were also my brother, and I knew you loved me even when we fought. I never doubted that. Adrian broke then, sobbing openly, and I felt James's spirit wrap around us both, a sensation of warmth and comfort. Through me, James spoke once more, and his words were gentle but firm. Live, Adrian. Stop punishing yourself for deaths you did not cause. Love Eleanor. Marry her. Be happy. That is what I want for you. That is the only forgiveness you need. I felt James beginning to fade, his energy spent, but before he left entirely, he had one more message. Tell her, he said, his voice growing distant. Tell Eleanor that she has given you back to me, that she has helped you see the truth, and that I am grateful. Tell her to take care of my foolish brother, because heaven knows he needs it. And then he was gone, withdrawn back into whatever realm the dead inhabited, and I was left gasping, exhausted, slumped in my chair. Adrian was beside me instantly, supporting me, his arms around me, murmuring my name. When I had recovered enough to speak, I told him what James had said at the end, and Adrian laughed, a real laugh, the first I had heard from him in days. That sounds like James, he said, always having the last word. We sat together in the dying candlelight, and I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. The mysteries were solved. The dead had spoken. Justice had been served, and forgiveness had been given. What remained now was only the future, uncertain and precious, and ours to shape. Adrian helped me to the sofa and sat beside me, pulling me close. He did not speak for a long time, and neither did I. We simply held each other, letting the silence stretch, comfortable and complete. Finally he stirred, pulling back just enough to look at me. Eleanor, he said quietly, I know this is too soon. I know we have only been courting for a month. But I also know that I do not want to waste any more time. I have lost too much already. I do not want to lose you. You will not lose me, I said, though my heart had begun to race. He took my hand and raised it to his lips, kissing my palm. Then marry me, he said. Not because my brother's ghost told me to, but because I love you, and I want to spend whatever time I have left in this world by your side. Marry me, Eleanor Hartwell. I looked at him, at this man who had come to me as a skeptic and had become something far more precious, and I felt the last of my defenses crumble. Yes, I said, my voice steady and sure. Yes, Adrian, I will marry you. He kissed me again, deeper this time, with a passion that took my breath away, and I returned it with equal fervor. When we finally broke apart, we were both laughing, giddy with relief and joy, and the sheer impossibility of how we had arrived at this moment. We would marry in the spring, we decided quietly, with only a few close friends as witnesses. We would begin a new life together, free from the ghosts of the past, though I would continue my work as a medium and he would continue his as an inspector. We would honor the dead by living fully, by choosing love over fear, by building something good and true from the ashes of grief and guilt. But there was still one more night to get through, one more revelation waiting in the shadows. Neither of us knew it yet, but the spirits had one final gift to give us. One last truth that would set us both free in ways we could not yet imagine. I did not hold another séance for nearly 2 weeks after Adrian's proposal. I needed time to recover from the intensity of contacting James, and more than that, I needed time simply to be happy, to luxuriate in the knowledge that I was loved and would be married to a man I loved in return. Adrian and I spent every possible moment together, planning our future, speaking of small domestic details that felt impossibly precious. Where would we live? Would I continue my sessions? And if so, how would we arrange the household to accommodate them? Would he mind if I kept Mrs. Bramwell on as housekeeper, for she had been loyal and kind, and I could not bear to dismiss her. We decided that we would keep my townhouse in Belgravia, for it was already arranged for my work, and Adrian would move his few belongings from the bachelor lodgings he had maintained near Scotland Yard. We would travel to Hertfordshire in the spring, after the wedding, to visit the family estate that now belonged to Adrian, though he had not set foot there since his father's death. It would be painful, he said, but he thought it was time to face those ghosts as well, and perhaps to make new memories there with me. I met what remained of his family, a maiden aunt named Constance, who had moved to Bath after becoming widowed, and who travelled to London specifically to take tea with me and assess whether I was suitable. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with an acid tongue and a surprising warmth beneath her severe exterior. She asked me pointed questions about my work, about whether I truly believed I spoke to the dead, or whether it was simply a performance for the gullible and grief-stricken. I answered honestly, telling her that I knew how it sounded, that I understood skepticism, but that my gift was as real as the hand she held her teacup with. She studied me for a long moment, and then she smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. "Good," she said. "Adrian needs someone who will not lie to him, even when the truth is uncomfortable. You will do very well indeed." The weeks slipped by in a haze of happiness, December giving way to January, and I began to believe that the darkness was truly behind us, that we had weathered the worst and emerged whole on the other side. But I should have known better. I should have remembered that the dead do not always say everything they need to say in one visit, that sometimes the most important truths take time to surface. It was a cold night in late January when I held my next session. A small gathering that included Lady Pemberton and 2 other regulars, and also a new client, a young woman named Miss Sarah Drummond, who had recently lost her mother. Adrian waited in my study as usual, working on case files, content to let me do my work while he tended to his own. The session began normally enough. I made contact with Lady Pemberton's daughter, relayed messages of comfort and love. The other spirits came and went, gentle presences that asked nothing more than to be remembered. And then I reached out for Miss Drummond's mother, and everything changed. Instead of the mother, I felt a different presence push forward, familiar and insistent. James. But this time, he was not alone. There was someone with him, another spirit, female, anxious and urgent. I tried to make sense of what I was feeling, tried to understand why James had returned and who he had brought with him. And then I knew. The woman was the governess, James's lost love, the woman for whom he had been willing to sacrifice everything. I opened my eyes, my heart racing, and looked around the table at the assembled guests. They were all watching me expectantly, waiting for me to speak. I hesitated, uncertain whether I should reveal what I was sensing, whether it was meant for this audience or for Adrian alone. But James's presence surged with such intensity that I gasped, and I knew he would not be denied. He had something to say, something that could not wait. I stood abruptly, startling my guests, and excused myself with a stammered apology. I left them sitting at the table, confused and concerned, and I went directly to my study, flinging open the door without knocking. Adrian looked up from his papers, alarmed by the wildness in my expression. "Eleanor," he said, rising quickly, "what is wrong?" "James is here," I said breathlessly, "and he has brought someone with him, the governess, the woman he loved." Adrian paled. "Why? What does he want?" "I do not know yet," I said, "but we need to go somewhere quiet, somewhere we will not be disturbed. He has something important to tell us." We went upstairs to my bedroom, the only place in the house where we could be truly alone, propriety be damned. I closed the door and locked it, then turned to Adrian. He was standing by the window, his whole body tense with anticipation. I sat on the edge of my bed and closed my eyes, opening myself to the spirits who waited. They came immediately, James and the governess together, their presences intertwined in a way that spoke of deep and abiding love. I felt their emotions wash over me, joy, sorrow, regret, and a fierce determination to right an old wrong. I began to speak, translating what they showed me, what they needed Adrian to understand. Her name was Anna, I said softly. Anna Fletcher. She was the governess in the household of your neighbors, the Harding family. James met her when he was 23 and she was 21. They fell in love slowly over the course of a year, meeting in secret in the woods between your estates. She was intelligent and kind and brave, everything James needed, everything he had been searching for. I felt Adrian move closer, and I continued, my voice taking on the distant quality that came when the Spirit spoke through me. When James told your father he intended to marry her, your father forbade it absolutely. He threatened to disinherit James, to cut him off without a penny, to ruin Anna's reputation so thoroughly that she would never find employment again. But James did not care. He was prepared to give up everything for her. They were planning to elope, to go to Scotland where they could marry without your father's consent. But then your father discovered their plan, I said, and I felt a surge of anguish from both spirits. He went to the Harding family and told them that Anna had been conducting an inappropriate relationship with his son, that she was a seductress who had entrapped a young man above her station. The Hardings dismissed her immediately, without references, without even allowing her to collect all her belongings. She was sent away in disgrace. James tried to find her, I continued, but your father had been thorough. He had paid the Hardings to refuse to reveal where they had sent her. James searched for weeks, growing increasingly desperate, increasingly reckless. That was why he was so angry the night he died. He had just learned that Anna was somewhere in London, working in a factory under an assumed name, and he wanted to go to her immediately. Your father tried to stop him, and that argument, that final confrontation, ended on the stairs. I paused, feeling the weight of what came next. Anna never knew that James had died, I said quietly. She thought he had abandoned her, that when his father made it difficult, James had simply given up and chosen his inheritance over her love. She spent 2 years believing that, working in poverty, her health failing from the brutal conditions of factory life. She died of consumption when she was only 23, still thinking that James had betrayed her. I opened my eyes and looked at Adrian. He was standing very still, tears running silently down his face. They found each other again, I said, and now my voice was my own again, though I still felt the spirits close. Beyond the veil, after Anna died, James had been waiting for her, searching for her just as he had in life. And when she crossed over, he told her the truth, that he had never abandoned her, that he had died trying to reach her. They have been together ever since, in whatever form love takes in that place. But they have carried one regret, one burden, and that is the truth they never got to share with the living. What truth? Adrian asked, his voice hoarse. I stood and went to him, taking his cold hands in mine. Anna was with child when she was dismissed, I said gently. James's child. She gave birth alone, in a workhouse, 3 months after he died. A daughter. Anna was too ill to care for her, too poor to keep her. The child was taken by the parish and placed in an orphanage. Adrian stared at me, shock and comprehension dawning in his eyes. James had a daughter, he whispered. I have a niece. Yes, I said, and James and Anna want you to find her. They want you to know that their love had a living legacy, that something good came from their tragedy. The child would be nearly 5 years old now. Her name, Anna said, or at least the name Anna gave her before they took her away, was Eleanor. I felt my own breath catch at that. The same name as mine. It could not be coincidence. The spirits did not deal in coincidence. Adrian pulled me against him, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Do you see?" he said, his voice breaking. "Do you see why James brought me to you? Why he pushed us together? It was not just about me finding happiness. It was about this. About his daughter. About finding her and bringing her home. We have to find her," I said. "We have to bring her home." Adrian nodded against my hair. "We will," he said. "I promise you, we will." The spirits withdrew then, their message delivered, their burden shared. I felt them go with a sense of peace and completion, and I knew they would not return again. They had said everything they needed to say. The rest was up to us. We went downstairs together, and I apologized to my guests for the disruption and ended the session early. They departed with varying degrees of confusion and concern, but I could not bring myself to care. My mind was already racing ahead, thinking of how we would begin the search, where we would start. Adrian stayed with me that night, propriety abandoned entirely. We sat together in my parlor, making plans, and when exhaustion finally overcame us, we fell asleep on the sofa, wrapped in each other's arms. Mrs. Bramwell found us there in the morning and said nothing, only brought us tea and toast and left us to our whispered conversations. The search for Eleanor Fletcher, James's daughter, took 3 weeks. Adrian used every resource at his disposal, calling in favors from other inspectors, searching parish records, visiting orphanages across London. I accompanied him when I could, and I used my own methods as well, reaching out during meditation, asking the spirits to guide us to the child who carried James's blood. We found her finally in a small orphanage in Islington, a grim building that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. The matron was a sour-faced woman who clearly regarded the children in her care as burdens rather than blessings. But when she brought out the girl, I knew immediately that we had found her. She was small for her age, with dark curly hair and gray-green eyes that were startlingly familiar. James's eyes. She looked at us warily, this thin child in a too large dress, and I felt my heart break for her, for all she had lost without ever knowing it. Adrian knelt down to her level, and his voice was gentle when he spoke. "Hello, Eleanor," he said. "My name is Adrian. I am your uncle. Your father was my brother, and I have been looking for you for a very long time." The child studied him solemnly. "Do I have to stay here?" she asked finally, her voice small and hopeful. "No," Adrian said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "No. You are coming home with us, if you would like to." The girl looked at me then, and I smiled at her, this little Eleanor who shared my name. "I am going to be your aunt," I said softly, "and we are going to take very good care of you." She considered this for a moment, and then she nodded, a sharp, decisive gesture that reminded me so much of James, of the spirit who had fought so hard to make this moment possible that I had to blink back tears. We took her that very day, Adrian wielding his authority as an inspector to cut through the bureaucracy, promising to return with proper documentation. We brought her to my townhouse, and Mrs. Bramwell took one look at the child and immediately set about preparing a room for her, muttering about hot baths and decent meals and what a disgrace those orphanages were. Little Eleanor ate as though she had never seen food before, and then she fell asleep in my arms, exhausted and overwhelmed. I carried her up to the room Mrs. Bramwell had prepared, tucked her into the clean white sheets, and sat beside her, watching her sleep. Adrian joined me, sitting on the other side of the bed, and together we watched over James's daughter, this unexpected gift, this living proof that love endured even beyond death. We married in March, as we had planned, in a small ceremony attended by Aunt Constance, Mrs. Bramwell, and little Eleanor, who served as our flower girl and took her duties with utmost seriousness. I wore a dress of ivory silk, and Adrian wore a dark suit, and when we exchanged our vows, I felt the presence of spirits all around us, James and Anna and Thomas and all the others who had loved us and lost us and found us again. The reception was held in my parlor, the same room where I had conducted so many sessions, where Adrian had first come to me as a skeptic, where James's spirit had spoken the words that had changed both our lives. We drank champagne and ate wedding cake, and little Eleanor laughed, a sound so pure and bright that it seemed to fill the house with light. That night, after Eleanor had been put to bed and the house had settled into silence, Adrian and I stood together at the window of our bedroom, looking out at the London night. He held me close, his chin resting on top of my head, and I leaned back against him, feeling safe and whole in a way I had never quite felt before. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything, for helping me find the truth, for loving me despite all the darkness in my family's past, for giving me a future I never thought I would have." I turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you," I said, "for believing in me when I could not fully believe in myself, for seeing past the strangeness of what I do to the woman beneath, for giving me a family again." "We have given each other that," he said, and he kissed me, gentle and sure. We did visit Hertfordshire that spring, taking little Eleanor with us, and it was difficult as Adrian had predicted. But we walked through the house together, the three of us, and we spoke of James and Anna and the love they had shared. We placed flowers on James's grave in the family cemetery, and I felt his presence there, peaceful and complete. I continued my work as a medium, and Adrian continued his as an inspector, and together we raised Eleanor as our own. She grew up knowing who her parents had been, knowing the story of their love and sacrifice. She grew up understanding that death was not the end, that love transcended all boundaries, and that the spirits of those who had gone before us never truly left us. I never saw James or Anna again after that night in January when they led us to their daughter, but I felt them sometimes, in quiet moments, a sense of warmth and approval, a whisper of gratitude. They had found peace, and they had given us the gift of each other and of the child they had made together. The years passed, and we were happy. There were difficulties, of course, as there always are in any life. Cases that haunted Adrian, sessions that left me drained and shaken, the small frustrations and sorrows that come with raising a child. But we faced them together, and the love between us only deepened with time. Little Eleanor grew into a remarkable young woman, intelligent and compassionate and brave, with her father's intensity and her mother's gentle heart. She inherited my gift as well, though it manifested differently in her, more as an intuition than as direct communication with the dead. She used it well, helping others, following in our footsteps. And on quiet evenings, when Adrian and I sat together by the fire, our hands clasped, our daughter reading nearby, I would think of that first night when he had come to my door, skeptical and grieving and lost. I would think of the ghost who had proposed on his behalf, of the mystery we had solved together, of the truths the dead had shared to set us all free. I learned in those years that love could come from the most unexpected places, that the dead could speak wisdom the living needed to hear, and that sometimes the greatest gift the spirits could give us was not closure, but hope. Hope for a future we had not dared to imagine. Hope for love that transcended death itself. Hope for a family built not just on blood, but on choice and courage and the willingness to believe in something larger than ourselves. The medium who had once refused the detective had become his wife, his partner, the mother of his niece, the keeper of his heart. And the detective who had once scorned the supernatural had learned to trust in things he could not see, to honor the dead by living fully, and to love without reservation or fear. We were an unlikely pair, Adrian and I, joined together by ghosts and grief, and a love neither of us had expected. But we were right for each other, exactly right. And every day I thanked the spirits who had brought us together, who had refused to let us miss each other, who had known better than we did what we needed. In the end, it was not death that defined us, but life. The life we built together, the life we gave to Eleanor, the life we honored in those who came to me seeking comfort and truth. And when my own time came, many years later, when I finally crossed that threshold I had spent so long peering through, I knew Adrian would be waiting for me on the other side, along with James and Anna and Thomas and all the others who had loved me. But that was far in the future still. For now, there was only the present, precious and fleeting and full of grace. The fire crackling in the hearth, my husband's hand warm in mine, our daughter's soft breathing as she slept upstairs, and the quiet certainty that we were exactly where we were meant to be. The dead had spoken, and we had listened, and in listening, we had found not just answers, but each other. And that, I thought, was the greatest gift of all.